Okay, let's imagine. I'll just stress here, this is not today. This is beyond 2020. So a lot of these things haven't happened yet, but just imagine if they did. And we've split them up into, I think, 4 slides. From a regulatory framework point of view, I'm going to come down here so I can see the screen. The new Radio Communications Act's in place. There is parameter-based licensing model that's in place. So we won't have a class-based licence. There's sort of a class-based, but a parameter-based. So it can be based on the parameters of the radio, of the bandwidth, of whatever. What that actually gives us, and the structure that's being put in place, is we could have a licence for 20 years. There's no restriction to it. That's what's actually being put in place. Self-determination. The OCMA, if they can get rid of more stuff, they will. They're not into administrivia, believe me. So that's about self-determination. We actually can determine the direction that we take this hobby. Deregulation is the driver. They don't want red tape. They want to get rid of it. They want to simplify it. And a code of practice may be in place for amateur radio. You see endless ads on television for the television code of practice. What about an amateur radio code of practice that we actually administer? In the spectrum space, and now this takes up, I'm hearing you loud and clear about interference. It's a digitally enabled RF landscape and band plan. In fact, analog's probably going to be novel. Interference is the norm. We're not going to get rid of it. And amateurs are employing novel technical solutions to get over the noise level. And they're already around. The Joe Taylors of this world are producing some pretty impressive pieces of software. Virtual and remote shacks are everywhere in non-interference places, up on hills somewhere. And this is the main product that a club offers to their members, access to their remote site. WIA has its own frequency assigners. It's a novel concept. Actually listening to the spectrum is a novel pastime instead of looking at a screen. Okay, training and education. Anyone can access amateur radio, the democratisation of the hobby. Thank you, Brian. All assessments and training are performed online. All of those horrific amount of paperwork that you go through, and I'm an assessor, I go through it as well, and I curse and swear every time I have to fill out all the paperwork. So as a driver, well-defined academic pathways link amateur radio training to professional occupations. So we actually have a pathway. Once you've got your amateur radio licence, actually you can go somewhere else with it. And there's clear linkages. Primary and high school students, and this takes up another point, the primary and high school students have a compelling value proposition, so they actually want to do it. It's part of their training through the STEM curriculum to access bits of amateur radio. And then that's the link. Grant money flows to support the STEM education and training programs, because there's a lot of money out there right at the moment that can flow if you're in STEM. You link it to STEM and the money flows. WIA is a source of training and education material, much like the ORRL. Who thinks the ORRL is an amateur radio club? They're a publisher. Have a look at their financial statement. The knowledge economy. Amateur radio is accepted as a valued contributor to the knowledge economy. Actually, it's recognised as. Novel experimental solutions attract research and development grants, and they're realised into production. And those internet radios are a good example of that. Somebody's thought outside the square and thought, hang on, if I use this Android phone and I put an app on it, I can actually turn this into something that looks like a radio, but it's using the internet as a backbone. Okay, novel idea. Amateur radio qualifications are accepted by professional bodies. Amateur radio is accepted as a technology thought leader in the Internet of Things, the maker spaces and the hacker spaces. There's a lot of groups out there who know a little bit about RF but don't know detail, and AR clubs can fill in that gap. And we garner support, and we're actually already going down this path right at the moment. So this is not future, this is present. For broader cross-section, so in the form of discounts from vendors. Anyway.
Justin, it's interesting to note that the American Rifle Association,
NRA.
NRA Association, the biggest attraction for membership is discounts on holidays and all that sort of stuff, and that's how they got their membership numbers up so high.
Right. That's everything else, not doesn't really relate to guns. All yours. So I'm going to hand to David to basically take us through, bring us probably back to reality and back to where we are and what we're putting in place to actually get some of those Beyond 2020 things happening.
Thanks, Justin. I haven't read through some of these slides myself, so I might just come down here. So I know that I'm standing between all of us and lunch, so I'm keen that today runs pretty well. I'll also highlight that this morning I've been drinking a lot of water, so this session also stands between me and the bathroom, so I'm quite keen to make sure that this runs pretty well. All right, it was November last year, I think it was, that Aidan, who's just stepped out of the room, ran us through a core purpose of the WIA. So when you look at an organisation like the WIA, obviously there's many things that it can be, and there's many things that it should be. We've heard quite a bit this morning about what we want to do and some of the aspirations that we're running for. That point about the NRA is absolutely fantastic, and that's some of the lateral thinking that we probably need as an organisation to move forward beyond 2020. So a few short years after 2020, in 2025, my young son, Alexander, who's now 2, will be 9. Marcus over there, his daughter will be 7. And it's about that sort of time when I first became interested in electronics, a couple of years ago now. And that's a theme that we heard again and again through the membership survey. So we heard that the gateway into amateur radio is about experimenting with electronics and then escalating that to the point where we're dealing with stuff that can talk across the world in isolation of other networks. So where we need to reach out for beyond 2020 is into those environments and into those communities. So when we come back to the core purpose, it's interesting how much things have stayed the same and potentially how much they've changed. So when you look at, have we got the objects here somewhere? Next one. Thank you. So this was written in, Brian, help me out, 2004? Yep, very good. Now, by removing some of the legalistic terms that are typically in these things, they're in the ellipses there, to promote, advance and represent amateur radio and the interest of radio amateurs. As a group, and let's try and open this up a bit. Anyone disagree with that statement as the purpose of the WIA? Anyone agree with it? Yeah. Yep, excellent. That's what we're here for, and that's what we're all here for. To protect and enhance the privileges of radio amateurs. Beautiful. To encourage an awareness of the value of amateur radio. To educate and encourage potential radio amateurs. To represent radio amateurs both nationally and internationally. To provide services for radio amateurs and those interested in amateur radio. Not so much? So that was Roger that said that, is that right? Excellent, all right. Look, and they haven't changed much. And when you go beyond 2020 and into 2025, when people like my son will be interested in this sort of stuff, or potentially interested in this sort of stuff, not that I'm pushing him at all, that's what he'll be engaging with. And the definition around what amateur radio is at that point, and what it has been over the last century or so, potentially be very different. We see lots of convergence. So we just saw a little piece about mobile phones converging with, was it a VHF thing? I didn't quite see it, but anyway. And that's a similar theme that we've seen across most technology stacks. So we've seen in IT, we've seen in enterprise services, especially in the governance space and as well as enterprise, lots of different technologies coming together that overlap, and then they work together as an ecosystem. So that's something that we've been looking to set up with the WIA. And when you start to look at these things, not what do we need this year, do we need a ticketing system, do we need a new website, do we need a Facebook page, all that kind of stuff. What this is about is what does the organisation need in 10 years' time? What does it need in 15, 20 years' time? What's the sort of capabilities that we need to set up to be able to support these things beyond 2020. And that's what we're here today for as well. So this afternoon we'll obviously hear lots of sessions about some of the directions that the organisation's going in, some of the directions that the hobby's going in, see some pretty cool stuff from some pretty good presenters. And so some of the things behind that with the WIA that we've been setting up this year is certainly to support those things moving forward. So you've heard a little bit about the ticketing system and how that's been trialled. Anyone from Redcliffe? I saw Kevin here somewhere. Where are you, mate? Yeah, over there too, Kevin. Very good. So online submission of exams. I think there's a system that you trialled in the last couple of months, which was using a PDF instead. Not hard, but it's an electronic submission of exams as opposed to, assessments, as opposed to using the old paper-based forms. And I think it's been pretty successful, Ed, and I think you had a part in that as well, yeah?
Yeah, no, there's two sort of activities underway. One of them certainly is the PDF, and there's a very, very embryonic trial of trying to bring the process right to the front.
Yeah, and look, a few things like, been a bit of discussion about the office in Bayswater. Is that the right model going forward? Especially when we heard earlier today that across the country we've got hundreds of volunteers or 100 volunteers that are involved in delivering these services. So very hard to get to the Bayswater office. Greg, for example, I think you've done 3 or 4 trips this year, just doing some of the stuff going from Sydney down to Melbourne. And for everyone to be able to contribute, so we've had a show of hands today and yesterday with people that want to be on committees. Just for everyone to be able to contribute, trying to do that in a physical, non-digital, non-geographically dispersed manner is pretty hard. So we need these systems that are set up to go and support that. And we've also seen a lot of the costs, if you drill down into some of those financials, they are based a lot, especially with the ACMA deed, on performing manual processes that are paper-based and that involve a lot of time. I heard a statistic, and I haven't validated it, but I think each exam that goes through takes about 45 minutes for the office to process each one.
That's correct.
Yep. So a few costs, obviously, involved in that, and something that we absolutely need to streamline. So when you run through all the fun stuff that we can go and do, all these different platforms, what's a pretty key one that keeps coming up is business process management. And really what that means is merging manual steps within the office, so moving around pieces of paper, digitising those, moving them online, and if it's a step that a person doesn't have to do, a person doesn't do it. And you see a corner of that which is in the ticketing system at the moment, so if you're interested, that's a thing that's based on OS Commerce. I don't know the version, but I'm sure Aidan, OS ticket, sorry. I'm sure Aidan can tell us the version. He's been fairly deeply involved in that. And these are not one of those steps that you do is a big bang approach. It's instead a capability that gets stood up, which Aidan's been doing with the office. And you take processes out one by one and you move them out of being manual steps and you put them into being digitised and through things like the ticketing system. So that's business process management systems. And has anyone interacted with that so far? What's your experience been like? Yeah, Rafi? A few of you? Yeah? Excellent. And before, what that looked like for the office is they were managing all of those requests through an email. So now, if you get a request that comes through and someone says, hey, I need this, and then you've got to remember a couple of weeks later, oh, did I respond to that or not? It becomes pretty hard, becomes pretty stressful, and it's easy for things to slip through the cracks. But with something like a ticketing system, it's pretty straightforward.
The other thing that it provides is visibility. The other thing that these systems provide is visibility. It's an extraordinary challenge to try and manage any operation when you can't see what's happening inside the gears. Very, very challenging indeed. And the process that we've undertaken right at the beginning of this, it's certainly has identified a number of pretty key issues that need to be addressed.
Just generally, like I mentioned when I was talking earlier about the issues of the very high manual overhead in the National Office, the other thing that this ticketing system, which is a class of product that's actually called a service management system, which sort of probably more correctly describes what it does. But the thing about that is we move from a situation where all the processes and the step-by-step and what you need to do here and what you don't do here are all in people's heads. And we're gradually moving to a process where these things are embedded as a workflow within the system. So what actually occurs within a service management system is the steps are in there. For instance, if a particular request comes in about I'll use the other thing, moon bounce, that we can put in the ticketing system that we know the resolver group for that, and that will automatically, once it's been put under that classification, be sent to that resolver group, which means if there's 3 or 4 people who have their email addresses in the system that are the resolver group for that, they'll get that. One of them picks it up, the system knows that they've done that, and we can also put in service levels such that if there's time frames on this, the service levels can escalate. In fact, one of the interesting things that, as this was put in, the office was putting in the service levels triggers at the same levels as in the contract. In other words, the system initially would tell people, well, we've just missed the service level, and you have to sort of educate people in terms that you actually want to know before that happens, not when it happens. Anyway, that's my little bit on that.
All right, so that's the ticketing system. The other thing is when we set this up, the existing web servers is a physical box that's living in Adelaide in a data centre that's there. So now I'm an Adelaide boy, it's great. Steve, no offence. What we need though is something that's not hosted in Adelaide. What we need is something that's hosted globally. And so what we've done is we've set up some new platforms which are part of and this is not an advert for Amazon by any intent, but it is scalable, meaning we can add new servers in sort of 5 minutes time, and it can scale both up and scale down depending on what we need to do with, say, coming up to an event like the AGM. We can certainly increase that, as well as if we're bringing on new services that aren't going to live for very long, perhaps dealing with some of the event stuff, then we can stand that up for a very short amount of time. That can be in flight for as long as it needs to, and then we can shut it down again afterwards. So that gives the organisation a lot more flexibility than it's had in the past. And those servers that are hosted in Adelaide, they're ageing a fair bit now, and they're well past due for some upgrade and some attention. So The other element that we set up, and look, a great point before about new foundation licences when they come through. They haven't heard much about the WIA. The other thing that we've set up is a customer relationship management system, which now what that means is basically when we get a new lead that comes into the organisation, which may be a foundation member, we actually want to know about them earlier than that. So we want to know when someone first interacts with amateur radio or with these strategies when we're first dealing with hobby electronics. We want to capture their details at that point, and we then want to be able to expose them in a graduated way to what amateur radio is all about, or what the hobby is all about, and escalate them up through electronics and hobby electronics, obviously into being in touch with either a club or being in touch with the WIA. So this is describing a marketing funnel basically. So at the very top, if you imagine a funnel that you use to put oil in your car, at the very top it's very wide and you get lots of people that are coming into that. Then as people move through these steps, you lose a few people along the way. So we might hold a session like tomorrow, and it sounds like there might be radio and television and all sorts of stuff that's there, which is fantastic. Get their details, make sure that we can send them emails, that we can give them pamphlets, all that kind of stuff, and drive them forward. And then we can keep in touch with them and get them interested in the hobby. So that's the first step. Second step, obviously, get in touch with the WIA, get in touch with clubs, get in touch with their local school, whatever channels and avenues are available. Second step, then obviously get them to go through some sort of education, learning and assessment. That's where all that plugs in, and we're getting whittling down as we move through that funnel and losing people along the way, until ultimately they're operating amateurs. And then finally, what's important in that is keeping them coming back into the clubs, keeping them engaged with the hobby, and really representing the hobby for everyone across the country and bringing in new people. So that's a custom CRM system that we've put in. Its first prototype is with the Associates program, and the Associates program is a free introduction to the WIA and the hobby. It's basically just a contact list, email that we can send out to people now. So that's something that's in place now, and there's a website you can go to that you can send people to go and sign up. We've also set up, we've recruited 6 volunteer digital project managers. So 6, not 1, not 2, not a couple, 6, which is a huge number. And these are guys that are, I guess as far as diversity goes, they're all guys. Great to have some women there, but we don't. These are people that have ran $25 million, $50 digital projects across the world. Most of them new entrants to Australia, but very, very experienced as far as running IT projects go. So they're currently looking at the bookshop, which is interesting, we haven't mentioned that yet, but they're currently looking at what to do with the bookshop and sorting out some of the stock take stuff that you might see that's in some of those reports. Also set up an independent strategy advisory committee, so that's chaired by Brian, and Aidan and myself are on that as well as Peter. Where are you, Peter? Somewhere? Peter Schrader. You stepped out, all right. And look, the other things that we've certainly been focusing on in 2017 and 2018 is understanding the context of the organisation, understanding, of course, its history, some of the directions that it's gone in previously, and where we're thinking about going tomorrow. And of course, there's some of the financial stuff that we spoke about this morning. And look, that's an absolute Herculean effort to turn an organisation around in a fairly short amount of time to that sort of nature. It's almost a complete backflip. I've never heard of an organisation that's flipped around that quickly, going from, I think last year was a $70,000 loss to now getting close to a neutral balance organisation. So that is a huge activity to happen through 2017 and 2018, and I think something that John Longerow and Greg and all the others that have been working on the organisation to improve it should be very, very proud of. Okay, so what's next? Other than I'm out of time, what's next? What's that? Yeah, that's right. You can hear the pitch of my voice increasing a little bit.
Do you want me to take over?
Oh, thank you for that. Excellent. All right. So what's next? Look, many of the themes we've already touched on this morning. So in the open forums. So what do we need to do? And time again, we hear the WIA needs to do this. The WIA needs to do that. That's great. Good. Great idea. Everyone's quite sure the problems are. But what do we need to do next is stick your hand up and go and do something about it and coordinate it through the WIA. I think I can summarise this slide as that. All right, excellent.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.